Welcome to The Dark Docket, the podcast where we explore the fascinating intersection between the law, the paranormal, and the macabre. I'm your host, Aiden, and tonight we're going to examine some criminal defenses that will have you doubting your own free will. In the last episode, we looked at some legal cases that dealt with the issue of whether we can take a supernatural entity to court. If something goes wrong in our lives, can we sue God or the devil for causing it? But what happens if we do something wrong? Can we blame our actions on an entity that somehow controlled us? Make sure you're awake and compos mentis for this one, as we explore captivating cases where defendants suffered a loss of bodily control. Before I possess your attention, the power of Christ compels me to review this disclaimer. Nothing you hear on this show should be construed as legal advice. If you're facing a legal issue, please consult with a qualified attorney duly licensed in the appropriate state. Furthermore, while we strive for accuracy, we can't guarantee the complete historical validity of all facts and stories presented. Some details may be dramatized or simplified for narrative effect. So sit back, relax, and enjoy the show, but remember, we're here to spark your imagination, not to solve your ghostly legal disputes. Our first case begins with 11-year-old David Glatzel, who allegedly began experiencing strange occurrences and visions of an old man who threatened to harm his family if they moved into their newly rented home. As David's behavior became increasingly erratic, the family turned to Ed and Lorraine Warren, the well-known demonologists who had been involved in the infamous Amityville horror controversy just a few years prior. The Warrens claimed that David was possessed by multiple demons and performed several exorcisms on the boy. During these exorcisms, David's older sister, Debbie, was present along with her parents and her boyfriend, Arnie Johnson. Johnson reportedly challenged one of the demons to leave David and possess him instead. One should note that the 1973 movie, The Exorcist, contained a similar scene in which the younger priest character, Father Karras, shakes the possessed girl and demands that the demon take him instead. This is depicted as a desperate yet heroic act of self-sacrifice, and most likely influenced Arnie Johnson's behavior during this encounter. A short time after, Johnson began exhibiting odd behavior similar to David Glatzel's. On February 16, 1981, Johnson was at a dog kennel where Debbie worked. Their landlord, Alan Bono, was also present and had been drinking heavily. A confrontation broke out between the two men, and Johnson ended up stabbing Bono multiple times, resulting in Bono's death several hours later. Now, here's where this case takes a turn into uncharted legal territory. After Johnson was charged with Bono's murder, Johnson's lawyer, Martin Minella, attempted to enter a plea of not guilty by reason of demonic possession. This was a bold and unprecedented move in American jurisprudence, and this requires a short aside to explain why. Now, this was not the first time that a defendant had claimed to be demonically possessed when they committed a crime. This actually happens fairly frequently even today. A highly publicized example occurred in 1977, when serial killer David Berkowitz, aka the son of Sam, was captured by police and claimed that his killing spree was the result of demonic possession, although he later recanted that claim, stating that it was a hoax. Typically, claims of demonic possession were, and still are, used to support the criminal defense known as not guilty by reason of insanity. A court considering this defense does not have to believe in demonic forces. Instead, it would be up to the defense to prove, using expert testimony and psychological evaluations of the defendant, that the defendant was legally insane at the time they committed the offense. Different jurisdictions have different standards that they employ to judge whether a defendant truly was insane at the time of the crime, as opposed to merely suffering from diminished capacity or pretending to be insane. The traditional standard is the McNaughton rule, which came from an 1843 English case. There, the defendant shot and killed the secretary of the British Prime Minister, believing that the Prime Minister was part of a conspiracy against him. The court acquitted McNaughton by reason of insanity, and he was sentenced to a mental institution for the rest of his life. The rule essentially creates a presumption that the defendant is sane unless the defense proves, quoting the original language here, at the time of committing the act, the accused was laboring under such a defect of reason from disease of the mind as not to know the nature and quality of the act he was doing, or, if he did know it, that he did not know what he was doing was wrong. The idea is that to be guilty of committing a crime, there must be an actus reus, or guilty act, and mens rea, or guilty mind. An insanity defense admits that the guilty act took place, but that the defendant did not or could not possess the requisite guilty mind in committing the act, because the defendant did not know what he was doing or did not understand that it was wrong. In the US, the current federal rule is that the defendant must prove by clear and convincing evidence that at the time of the commission of the acts constituting the offense, the defendant, as a result of a severe mental disease or defect, was unable to appreciate the nature and quality or the wrongfulness of his acts. Slightly different, but largely the same as McNaughton. Returning to the Arnie Johnson case, the defense strategy faced immediate challenges. Counsel for the defense traveled to England to research similar cases of crimes committed while under alleged demonic possession, though none had actually gone to trial. He planned to bring in exorcism specialists from Europe as expert witnesses. He even threatened to subpoena the priests involved in David Glatzel's exorcisms if they didn't cooperate with the defense. The trial began on October 28, 1981, in Connecticut's Superior Court in Danbury. However, the presiding judge, Robert Callahan, promptly rejected the defense's plea of not guilty by virtue of demonic possession. Judge Callahan argued that no such defense could ever exist in a court of law due to lack of evidence, and that it would be irrelative and unscientific to allow related testimony. With their primary defense strategy rejected and deciding not to plead insanity, Johnson's team was forced to argue that he acted in self-defense. This meant that the jury was not legally allowed to consider demonic possession as an explanation for the killing. After deliberating for 3 days, the jury convicted Johnson of first-degree manslaughter on November 24, 1981. On December 18th, he was sentenced to 10 to 20 years in prison. In 1985, Arnie married his girlfriend Debbie while still in prison. Arnie was released for good behavior a year later, having only served 5 years. The pair stayed together until Debbie's death in 2021. While the devil made me do it defense didn't succeed in this case, it opened up a broader discussion about the intersection of supernatural beliefs and the legal system. The Arnie Johnson case has also made a lasting impact on popular culture. It inspired books, documentaries, and even Hollywood films, including 2021's The Conjuring, The Devil Made Me Do It. This demonstrates the enduring fascination with cases that blur the lines between the natural and supernatural worlds. So, was Arnie Johnson possessed when he stabbed his landlord? Who's to say? In a documentary made for Netflix about the trial, Debbie Glatzel's older brother, Carl, claimed that Arnie was always very possessive, no pun intended, of Debbie, and that there were rumors of an affair or previous relationship existing between Debbie and the landlord. The documentary concluded with Carl recounting that after his and Debbie's parents died, he found a note written by their mother indicating that their mother had been surreptitiously slipping Sominex into their family's food. Sominex is a discontinued sleep aid that was known to cause sedation and even hallucinations. If this story is true, it opens the door wide open for all kinds of speculation. Was the sleep aid responsible for David Glatzel's supposedly possessed behavior? Did Arnie Johnson end up ingesting this sleep aid during his time spent with the Glatzel family? And did he ingest enough of the drug such that he could not have been criminally responsible for stabbing his landlord? Outside of the criminal defense of not guilty by reason of insanity, there is a lesser-known defense of not guilty by reason of automatism. Automatism essentially argues that the defendant was not aware of their actions when committing the alleged illegal act, so it is a denial of actus reus, meaning the defendant claims their action, completely separate from their state of mind, was not voluntary, hence lacking culpability. Unlike the insanity defense, the defendant does not need to be mentally ill either. Instead, their actions can be caused by external factors like concussion, sleepwalking, epilepsy, reflexes, or involuntary intoxication. Basically, the defense has to show evidence of a total loss of voluntary control, not just impaired control. Quick side note, there is still an open question as to whether automatism can be claimed by a defendant who is allegedly acting under the influence of hypnosis. There is a case from Kansas in 1894 where Anderson Gray, a wealthy farmer, was involved in a lawsuit where his neighbor, Thomas Patton, was a witness. Gray manipulated his farmhand, Thomas McDonald, by falsely claiming Patton was spreading rumors about McDonald's wife. Gray allegedly hypnotized McDonald, convincing him that he needed to kill Patton, and while in a trance state, McDonald shot and killed Patton in the woods. Both Gray and McDonald were arrested for the murder, and Gray was found guilty and sentenced to death. But McDonald, despite admitting to the shooting, was acquitted based on the defense that he was under Gray's hypnotic influence. Over half a century later, Susan Atkins, a member of the Manson family who participated in the brutal 1969 murder of Sharon Tate and others, claimed she was under the hypnotic spell of Charles Manson at the time of the murders. This hypnosis was described as a form of brainwashing through food and water deprivation, forced drug consumption, and cult indoctrination. Atkins argued that Manson's influence left her unable to think for herself or control her actions. Despite this defense, the jury convicted Atkins of her role in the murders, citing the notable brutality and planned nature of the crimes that were carried out. If successful, though, the automatism defense can result in complete acquittal. The U.S. has seen automatism used as a defense both successfully and unsuccessfully, depending on the jurisdiction and the particulars of the case. The first recognized instance in the U.S. was the 1846 case of Massachusetts v. Terrell. There, Albert Jackson Terrell was accused of murdering Maria Bickford, a woman who worked in a Boston brothel. The crime was particularly brutal. The victim's throat was slit, nearly to the point of decapitation, and Terrell allegedly set fires to cover up the crime. Terrell then fled to New Orleans, but was captured and brought back to Boston for trial. His defense lawyer, who was a prominent attorney, argued that Terrell was a chronic sleepwalker who could have committed the murder while in a trance or nightmare state. The defense presented extensive testimony from family members and others about Terrell's history of sleepwalking. Now, it should be said that, at the time, very little was understood about sleepwalking, which may have worked in Terrell's favor. After less than 2 hours of deliberation, on March 30th, 1846, the jury found Terrell not guilty. From a modern perspective, though, Terrell's actions, including setting fires and fleeing the scene, seem inconsistent with sleepwalking behavior. Over time, Courts have gained a better understanding of conditions that can cause automatic behaviors, though, and the amount and quality of the evidence that defendants need to adduce has ratcheted up. One can look at the 2004 case of California v. Wrights, which involved the murder of Ava Marie Weinfurtner by her boyfriend, Stephen Otto Wrights. Sometime after deciding to go to bed, Wrights attacked Weinfurtner, beating her with a flower pot and stabbing her 4 times in the neck, which resulted in her death. Wrights claimed he didn't recall the attack, but remembered a dream about struggling with an intruder. Wrights did have a history of sleepwalking, but he was also previously diagnosed with bipolar disorder and had voluntarily consumed alcohol and recreational drugs on the night of the murder. Wrights challenged his initial conviction, and despite evidence of parasomnias, Wrights' conviction was upheld, and he was sentenced to 26 years to life in prison. Generally, if the defendant voluntarily engages in any behavior that makes the crime more likely or more foreseeable, for example by choosing to become intoxicated, this works to undermine an automatism defense. In conclusion, the intersection of law and the supernatural continues to present unique challenges for our legal system. The cases we've explored today highlight the complex issues that arise when claims of external influences enter the courtroom. We have seen that courts generally focus on the effects of belief rather than the validity of the beliefs themselves. As we move forward, the legal system will likely continue to grapple with cases involving claims of supernatural influence. While courts might not rule on the existence of spirits or demons, they will undoubtedly face the challenge of balancing respect for individual beliefs with the need to maintain a rational, evidence-based justice system. As we wrap up this episode of The Dark Docket, I encourage you to consider the many influences that affect your actions and behavior. Aside from demons and spirits, there are plenty of forces in this world that can diminish our autonomy. Think about how movies, TV shows, advertisements, and social media impact and shape our daily actions and choices. How do we distinguish between choices emanating from our will and the forces that surround us? Can we imagine a case where the defendant claims lack of responsibility for their actions because of the news channel they watch, or perhaps even the politician they support? Thank you for joining us for our devilish discussion on courtroom defenses. If you enjoyed this episode, please subscribe to The Dark Docket on whatever venue you tune in on. If you know of any interesting legal cases that involve the supernatural or the strange, please feel free to write to us at darkdocket@gmail.com. Join us next time as we continue to examine the complex intersection of law and the supernatural. Until then, remember, we can't always hold each other responsible for what we do, especially when we are not ourselves.